health, education, climate.
The United Nations, the World Bank, private actors.
Locally rooted institutions, locally rooted experts.
What we're really talking about is a very complex ecosystem.
How do we find the interlinks?
To innovate and come up with the best solutions.
To actually rethink what we do as a broader development community.
You're listening to the CGD Podcast,
where we explore smart policies for a better world.
Each episode highlights an important development topic,
hosted by a CGD researcher
and featuring experts from around the globe.
Tune in to learn how independent research
can bring global prosperity.
Hello, and welcome to the CGD Podcast. My name is Gyude. I'm a resident fellow here at the Center for Global Development. And on today's podcast, we're going to be talking about FOCAC 9. FOCAC is the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. FOCAC 9 was held in China, in Beijing, in September of 2024. We've been thinking about how to channel the financial commitments that were made in such a way that is beneficial to African governments. And a big part of our recommendation, which is coming out in the policy note, is the reauthorization of the Africa Grow Together Fund. For Africa, FOCAC is such an important event, and the commitments that were made at FOCAC go a long way in alleviating problems, especially when it comes to infrastructure financing in Africa. This is a really good jump-off point for this conversation because today, the U.S. Secretary of State announced that the purging of USAID is complete. 83% of the programs have been ended permanently. But also, China's 2 sessions just ended. And in his public remarks, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke about the importance of Africa to the global future. He talked about how the prospect of future modernization depends on Africa, and if Africa doesn't modernize, that's going to be a disadvantage for the rest of the world, not just Africa. So it's an excellent point to start off so that we can talk again on FOCAC. But today, I have 2 of the most knowledgeable people to have this conversation with. And so without much ado, I'll ask them to introduce themselves. We'll start with in alphabetical order. Hannah?
Thank you, Gyude, and thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm Hannah Ryder. I've been working in the development field for over 20 years. I'm the CEO of an African-led and African-owned international development consultancy called Development Reimagined. And we have offices in Beijing, Nairobi, and London. We're really well known for our work on Africa-China relations, especially on advisory, but we also do a lot of practical work on trade and investment between African countries and China.
Thank you. Yunnan?
Hi, Gyude. It's a pleasure to be here and joining you and Hannah. I'm Yunnan Chen. I'm a research fellow at ODI Global. We're a global affairs think tank that works on a range of issues from humanitarian affairs to climate to, in my field, development and public finance. And we have offices in London, Brussels, and more recently in Washington, DC. At ODI, I lead a portfolio of work focusing on China's overseas financing, its development finance institutions, implications for debt restructuring, and for policy implications for the donors of the global north.
Yunnan and I were overlapped at one point at CGD where we were colleagues. It's such a pleasure having you here. Hannah, you were quoted in a piece in Semaphore. And the question everyone's been talking about is, does USAID's withdrawal from Africa mean that this is a benefit to China?
I feel this question is quite a hard one because in the sense it's framing any cut of finance that was in the short term supporting thousands, if not millions of people, getting access to healthcare, education, etc., as a benefit to anyone. I feel that's a very difficult proposition in itself. But let me engage with it. So 2 key points. I think first, and this is what I said to Semaphore and my colleagues at Development Reimagined have said to others, is that China's aid doesn't really work in the same way as US's aid. There is no channel, for example, for an African non-governmental organization or a non-governmental organization from any other country to apply for Chinese finance. And even if African governments apply for Chinese aid, it usually has a link to specific technical assistance or equipment. And most or many USAID projects don't have those aspects at all. I think the overlap is a fairly small one, but where the overlap is in particular, I'd say aid to UN organizations. And you might remember back in 2020 when the US pulled out of the World Health Organization, China contributed $30 million to the World Health Organization literally a week after. Now, while that's big for China, China usually contributes about $200 million to WHO. The US usually contributes over $1.2 billion. So you can see like $30 million is not going to replace $1.2 billion. But that said, even since 2020, the China-UN relationship has strengthened. So we might see a bit more of that as a result, more contributions from China to the UN system, actually in the context of the Global Development Initiative. But my view is that it will most likely happen kind of more organically because of what's happening within China and so on. And I think just secondly, there are good reasons for China to step in, but I think very differently to how the US and even how China itself has really traditionally worked. I think there's a real opportunity, seizing opportunity even in bad times, like we did with COVID, of thinking through what exit strategies for aid might be. And I would say the focus has to be localization. And if that can happen, then I think there's definitely an opportunity for China to step in and do more. It has to be different to what USAID has been doing before.
Yunnan, what is your take?
I think to engage with the question on what's the impact for China, does China gain from this? From a political perspective, I have to say, China can sit back and doesn't have to do very much to get a huge credibility boost from not just what the US is doing. I think it's also important to step back and see this in a global context of what's happening from other northern donors. We've seen a systematic pullback in commitments to ODA over the last 5 years or so. We've seen recent cutbacks that have been quite dramatic from the UK, slashing aid to fund its defense spending, from the Netherlands, and generally, European donors all going in the same direction, perhaps not as dramatically as the US, but we are seeing a pullback and perhaps a disillusionment with the idea and this model of aid as a form of development cooperation that Hannah was describing. I think there are unfortunate aspects to this. And, we've been in this model for the last 50 plus years of aid and development as a form of soft power for many of these northern donors and global powers. But to really use aid and development cooperation strategically, it depends on, as one of our previous papers at ODA argues, it really depends on your consistency as a partner. And to segue this to how China acts as a donor, I think the case of FOCAC is a very good demonstration of China's soft power as a very consistent and politically engaged donor that doesn't just deliver material benefits, but is able to turn up and show up and maintain that stability of relationship over a really long time.
What China does and what the US does, what USAID does, it's not a one-for-one replacement. I think just the consistency, the reliability, and dependability of China, as we're seeing this upheaval across the West, not just the US, is also going to be a big boost to the Chinese too. However, China has an independent relationship with Africa that has absolutely nothing to do with what the West is doing. That is the focus of our podcast today. And for the last almost 25 years now, FOCAC has been sort of the centerpiece in terms of a mechanism for China engages with its partners in Africa. And so, Hannah, I want to come back to you for someone listening to this who doesn't know what FOCAC is. What is FOCAC and why is it important?
Okay, so I will plug a briefing that we have at Development Reimagined on FOCAC. So if you look up FOCAC Development Reimagined, you'll come to it. But FOCAC was created in 2000. It was created in response to African countries' requests and in China, seeking more coordination in their bilateral relationships with China. But there were some other models at the time. There was France's Africa Summit, which had been going since 1973. The Arab Africa Summit from 1977, which since 2010, talking of consistency, has been every 3 years like FOCAC. And the Tokyo International Conference on Aid and Development, which started in 1993, and that is held every 5 years. There was a model, and there are a huge list of things that are different about FOCAC. Maybe I can just mention a few which really stand out. And I think speaking to some of the points that have already been made around consistency, it has a regular fixed timetable and even has sort of annual preparation meetings at the senior official level. It also alternates venue between China and an African country, something that France, for example, is planning to do with its next France-Africa summit, but since 1973 hasn't done. I think importantly, process-wise, it's got an African co-chair, which none of the other summits have. And I think, we'll come to this at some point, I hope, but it makes a huge difference to the agency that African countries can express through the forum, because they can work really actively on the outcome documents if they want to, or they're organized enough to. And I think you do see the difference in that. But substantively and most importantly, what I think also differentiates it is that it's not just aid focused. It's also investment, loans for infrastructure, manufacturing, tourism. I mean, in the latest one, you saw stuff around space collaboration, AI, and much more. To be honest, sometimes I feel it's far too much, like far too busy. But other summits do focus on more specific themes or have only recently branched out. And I think, again, it's really important in the context of what we just discussed around USAID, because, the relationship of a country to another set of countries or even another country is not just about aid. It's about a whole set of other things. And FOCAC manages to cover all of those.
The thing about these Africa Plus One summits or unilateral summits is that toward the end, the host makes a big announcement of commitments over the next 3 years. And then FOCAC is no different, right? It started around 2006, was like 5 billion. The highest it's been was 60 billion in 2015 and 2018. This year, the calculation comes up to around $51 billion. And there's a policy note that will accompany this. And one of the recommendations I'm making is that, the observants are making is some of that money is channeled through debt, through loans. And the ability of African sovereigns to accommodate more loans is significantly constrained. So how FOCAC is how its commitments are channeled will determine if it's really useful to the African countries. And that's why it's really good we have Yunnan here, because she has a working paper on which she tracks the rise of commercial lenders in portfolio of lending, at least from China to Africa. Yunnan, can you tell us a little bit about your working paper and what you found in terms of the commercial composition of the lending?
Sure. I'll make a couple of points from this paper, and I want to shout out to my collaborator, Tianyi Wu, who worked with me on this commercial creditors paper, and a lot of the findings draw from her PhD research. And I also want to shout out to another collaborator, Teal Emery, and we have a forthcoming paper, which I'll discuss some of the findings from that. But essentially, in our research, what we're seeing is there's been a gradual and secular shift in what we think of as the model of Chinese infrastructure finance in Africa over the last 10 years. We kind of have this idea of how Chinese lending works. It's usually a sort of export buyer's credit. It's very much dominated by China Exim Bank and CDB to a lesser extent. This is policy bank finance that supports the export of Chinese goods and services, and it usually rides on an EPC contractor from a Chinese company. Over the last decade, we've seen several changing trends in how this model works. And actually, there's been a greater diversification in these financing modalities when it comes to infrastructure, but also more broadly, as we'll discuss in the most recent FOCAC commitments. So firstly, the role of commercial creditors in Africa has really boomed over the last decade, particularly in certain countries like Ghana and Zambia that you've also seen borrowing a lot from international capital markets. If you think of the big commercial banks, ICBC, Bank of China, CCB, their role in financing infrastructure alongside certain SOEs has risen quite substantially since 2015. And that really came after a policy push from on top within the Chinese government. And you'll see it in the FOCAC of that year to push for greater private sector participation in Africa and in some of these overseas projects. And this has been quite consistent, even as policy bank lending declined massively. The downside is, and some of the riskier aspects of this commercial lending, though, is that it's higher cost, it's shorter tenor, and negotiating debt restructuring with these commercial banks it's going to be a very different story compared to the debt restructurings that we've seen to date with Exim Bank and CDB. But the second trend I want to note is also that we've seen a much bigger emphasis in the last decade on risk mitigation, on project bankability. And as part of that, there's been this decline in bilateral lending, particularly after 2018 to Africa. Commercial lending has made up some of that shortfall, but it's still, not what it used to be 10 years ago. But with the rise of commercial banks, we're also seeing in more innovative approaches to risk sharing. So in a forthcoming paper from myself and Teal Emery, we look at the rise of co-financing and syndicated loans in financing infrastructure. And this is very much dominated by these large international commercial Chinese banks like ICBC and Bank of China. So I think there's a shift in model. There's a bigger emphasis on private sector. And in the most recent FOCAC as well, I think in the language, you see this emphasis on investment promotion, supporting the private sector to take on more risk, rather than that state-led model of the last decade.
The changing of the composition of loans from China is also reflected across the portfolio of most African sovereigns. We've come from more bilateral lending to now a significant portion of the debt that most African countries carry is commercial, whether from domestic commercial banks or from the international capital markets in Eurobonds. So we're seeing that, and it carries this risk, as we saw with Zambia during COVID. When it comes to negotiating a default, it's much harder to do with private creditors than it is to do with bilateral creditors. So one of the recommendations that I make in my piece is that maybe for the next 5 years or so, we can see a slight slowdown in that trend, at least when it comes to Chinese lending to the continent. But I presented as the core piece of the argument of the piece is that there was a fund that was created about 10 years ago in Africa. It was a combination of collaboration between the African Development Bank, China Exim, and People's Bank of China, called the Africa Growing Together Fund. It was $2 billion. It was at the African Development Bank and lent alongside. And I'm recommending that. It ended last year. It was mentioned at FOCAC, but it was not reauthorized. That the African side requests of the Chinese to reauthorize it or make it slightly bigger and expand it so that other African MDBs can have access to it. For example, like your Africa 50, your AFC, your TDB, but the possibility of national lenders like the Development Bank of South Africa can also have access to it, because especially for those national lenders who lend outside of the core markets. But Hannah, I want to turn to you on these recommendations that I've made. This is the space that your company works with African sovereigns and with the Chinese government. What do you think about these recommendations for the Africa Growing Together Fund, whether at the African Development Bank or channeled through the African Development Fund?
I think what Yunnan has mentioned around emerging trends, I think supporting or investing into African financial institutions, African multilateral financial institutions, is something that Chinese government and African side have both been advocating for and increasingly interested in. The AGTF really stands out, the Africa Growing Together Fund really stands out because it was not just for its size, 2 billion at the time, this was in 2014, and this is a peak in Chinese lending to African financial institutions to date, and different from the peak to bilaterals. But it was co-financed, it was to be disbursed over 10 years. And, before then, China had been in the African Development Bank since 1985, right? So it was based on that experience and seeing what the AFDB is doing, but trying to find a way to perhaps deliver in a way that's more understood by Chinese stakeholders, because you had the PBOC actually sort of checking every project that goes through. And we've seen over 40 different projects over the lifetime of the AGTF go forward, some pretty large ones, including a Nigerian electricity project. There are lots and lots of really good examples. The question is, what next? There's a very strong case, certainly, for reauthorizing the AGTF. There's also a case for China making a bigger direct contribution to the African Development Fund, which, again, has slowly increased its contributions to that, but there's an opportunity there. And there's a next replenishment of that coming up this year. but also with regards to other African banks. We've got Afrexim Bank, TDB, BOAD, a whole range of different African multilateral financial institutions. They have also borrowed from China in very different ways. Some of them will have China Exim Bank as a shareholder. Some of them even have some of the Chinese private sector contributing. They've also got CDB. Afrexim Bank in 2023 secured an additional 400 million from China Development Bank. And China Exim is already actually Afrexim's 7th largest overall shareholder. It is the largest non-African shareholder, in fact. So the interest is there. And again, coming back to what you were saying around risk, the benefit that it offers is being able to shield some of the very specific shareholders from some of the very specific risks that you might face project by project, but still supporting and getting the return, of course, still supporting these projects to go forward. What they also do is they still provide that return. And I think that's key. China's still got those foreign reserves, which drove the opportunity for borrowing from China. And this is certainly a really strong way to do it.
Part of the reason that I make this proposition is that, first of all, development lenders, because of their portfolio lending, because of their quality in project selection, because they already have, in terms of project implementation, the quality of project implementation, it means a significant numbers of this project will be done. But when the African Development Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank were making an argument for SDRs transferred to them, they argued that for every dollar for them, they can leverage 4. So it means that whatever monies are transferred to them means they can use the balance sheet to leverage that in ways that just lending project to project can't. But most importantly, an increase in commercial lending to African sovereigns at a time when other development partners are pulling back exposes them to risks. And so what do you think about this recommendation, especially now that you've documented an increase or China's willingness to do more from the commercial side? And basically, I'm asking them to step back and do more, but through regional lenders instead of directly country to country. What do you think?
Yeah, I heartily agree, Gyude. And in the forthcoming paper that we're writing on co-financing, we dig a little bit into the AGTF and some of these co-financing funds that have been established at the MDBs that China set up in 2014, the AGTF, African Development Bank, the co-financing fund with IDB. There's another co-investment platform at IFC. These have been really prominent in supporting green investments and in supporting energy transition infrastructure in Africa. And so I think I would very much support this policy recommendation of replenishment, but I struggle to see how that will happen, because I do think that their origins, right, the creation of these funds took place at a slightly different political moment back in 2013. We know that it was Zhou Xiaochuan at PBOC who was quite a strong instigator in creating a lot of these funds and in deepening China-Africa relations at the time. And, you know, China's foreign exchange surplus, although still substantial, it suffered quite a big decline after 2015. And we've seen a general greater risk aversion. So I'm a little more pessimistic, perhaps, on the potential or possibilities for PBOC to play that same role with these kinds of big billion-dollar funds. That said, I think I'd agree with Hannah that partnering with MDBs and using the experience, the technical capacity, the ability to manage risk that MDBs and other public development banks provide is something that benefits Chinese commercial and policy bank lenders. And we are seeing more appetite for these kinds of on-lending transactions and MOUs to support future co-financing and future project pipeline development between Chinese and regional development banks as well. And so I think there's a positive step or a positive future direction.
I agree. And I think what's happening in the domestic economy in China will be indicative of what kinds of risk the Chinese are willing and able to take going forward. You know, there's another piece from ODI, I think you read it. It was about sort of the convergence we didn't ask for, where DAC countries were beginning to converge in terms of their lending to match the Chinese and what the Chinese were doing. But I'm willing to accept here where for some of this channeling to the MDBs, if China added some add-ons, there has to be a certain amount of Chinese representation and stuff like that. If it simply means that money continues to flow in this direction. Hannah, I want to come to you because there are two massive funds that were created in the China-Africa relationship, CAD Fund and CAFIC. Each of them capitalized at $10 billion that are supposed to do more private lending, direct equity. Could you tell us a little bit about them and what are they, how are they different, how useful they can be in Africa as we're trying to channel more money to Africa through FOCAC?
Yeah, so CAD Fund, or China Africa Development Fund, that was set up in 2006. It has a mandate specifically to support Chinese companies going out to African countries. So this is not like one of the commercial creditors that Yunnan was talking about as a kind of set of different organizations, private firms. It's managed by the China Development Bank. So any project that's agreed by China Development Fund, by CAD Fund, has to go through the CDB. It's actually got offices in South Africa, Ethiopia, Zambia, Ghana, and Kenya. It has had some really interesting examples and very strong kind of examples of success with a lot of financing certain Chinese companies. Some of the most successful cases that you'll hear of, certain healthcare projects have had CAD funding to go out. It's basically like what BII does in some way, the British International Investment, that kind of DFC. But it has a very specific targeted mandate. The second one, China Africa Industrial Capacity Cooperation Fund, CAFIC, is a bit different. It's a bit more flexible. It was announced in 2015. As you said, it also has 10 billion USD capital. It does equity and loans. It has a different mandate because it's really just about kind of deal flow, less specifically around Chinese companies. So it can finance African companies, for example, that have a majority share, and again, has done that. But the main question for CAFIC is usually around return, the risk and return balance. So they're looking for projects which will have a very clear, obviously industrial focus, but that will have a clear return. CAD Fund too, to a degree, but there's a bit more flexibility on that criteria. So you'll find that CAFIC, they'll finance certain mining projects or telecoms projects where the business case is really clear. And it's not a very new thing to do, but the mandate is changing. And because of FOCAC, and I think this is a really important point for everybody to understand that, even though many of these institutions are used to working in specific ways, or the private sector might not want to do X, or certain state-led companies might not want to do Y, FOCAC is an opportunity to drive in a direction that African governments really want. And one of the big demands and pushes from African governments has been, can we have funds that can fund smaller projects as well as the big ones? We still want the big ones, don't get me wrong. But there is a missing gap for most of development finance organizations. There's a gap where many African projects are 5 million, 10 million, etc. Is there a Chinese organization out there that's willing to also support those sorts of things with debt, with equity, not grants, but that are real business propositions? And I think that's where your suggestions, Gyude, but also the suggestions of African governments are being taken seriously for the shape of both CAFIC and CAD Fund. CAD Fund is experimenting more with panda bonds, for example. So there are a whole range of things that are happening because of FOCAC that point in a different direction for these funds.
I had an opportunity to hang out with CAD Fund people. I talked to them. Initially, they had minimum ticket sizes, 50 million. Even CAFIC had a minimum ticket size of 15 to 20 million. But because of the FOCAC that the center of this podcast around, at that FOCAC, President Xi talked about small and smart, or small and beautiful, CRMA. And all of the China-focused funds were giving directives. They're supposed to do 1,000 of these projects in a 3-year period. First of all, I don't think that's going to happen. However, let's try to get as many of them as possible. So do these projects, these CRMA projects, do they present an opportunity sort of to balance the commercial and non-commercial? What do you think of them as means of being able to channel more Chinese funds?
So I think from the perspective of what's happening in the Chinese system and the changes and trends that we've seen in how China's overseas financing is evolving, I think Small and Beautiful is one manifestation of this bigger push towards discipline and risk mitigation as well. Right? I think for Chinese banks, we've seen a kind of recalibration in their appetite for the big ticket infrastructure projects, that some of which have not really come to fruition and have caused negative ramifications for debt sustainability. And Small and Beautiful is a shift or a pivot in some way towards a more commercial orientation in project selection and project development. It coincides very nicely with this policy shift that we've seen towards green investments. And we know that what China is exporting today is very much its own frontier capacities in clean technologies and renewables, electric vehicles, et cetera, and these kinds of energy transition projects very much fit the bill for the sort of commercial but disciplined and generally quite small ticket projects that Small and Beautiful would indicate. And these kinds of projects, I think, also have the advantage that, you know, we will be seeing more commercial modalities of financing where it's the suppliers or the contractors, the corporates themselves taking on a bigger share of risk through investment or through potential PPPs or collaborations, rather than the kind of debt-financed, bank-led model of years past. And I think that leaves the policy banks or the larger financiers to take a bit more of a strategic approach in their portfolio, using the concessional financing that China Exim Bank, for example, provides to direct their lending towards more strategic and more targeted projects that can support broader transformation.
Hannah, as we close out, what can we do so that we can increase deal flow with these, so that African projects get financed? But also, more importantly, with CAD Fund, the conversation was there always has to be a majority of Chinese interest. And one of the examples is AWA Airlines in Ghana. It is co-owned by Hainan Airlines, CAD Fund, and a local Chinese partner. Those are the kinds of projects that we want. And as many of those as we can get, that would be great. How can we increase the flow so that more of those projects happen?
As an economist, I'm going to say we've got to work on both the demand and the supply side. But I'll add something to that as well, because I think we also have to do a lot more coordination. So in terms of demand side, from the African side, I think we have to do a lot more to actively promote investment projects in China. We've got to be a significantly more targeted, more active, going to China to meet with a huge range of different stakeholders, to tell them about different projects and therefore increase the deal flow. I mean, communication is everything. I think many of these issues around risk, whether we're talking about China or anywhere else, and how Africa is viewed, I think is often to do with an asymmetric information problem, right? You know, it's people don't know enough about the continent. And so the more that African businesses go over to China and promote these projects, that will do a lot. On the supply side, I think, Gyude, you have talked about shifting mandates for CAD Fund, CAFIC. 100% agree with that. They do need to be more flexible, both in terms of ticket size, but also in terms of instruments. Be as cheap as possible, number one. And, you know, that isn't always in line with commerciality, if we're thinking about that. But these are government supported, so that's where they can make a difference. And be flexible also in terms of African partnership. This is also what China's own experience was that China got the best in terms of technology transfer and understanding by having joint ventures and so on. And then I think the last thing to make these funds work for the African continent is for a great deal more coordination between African governments and African players. Even talking about what Yunnan was mentioning, or what she's identified as the trends with the commercial banks, we're at a 1984-ish, 1985, perhaps 1989 already moment for Africa, where we did this before. We had a lot of bilateral lending in the 70s. Suddenly interest rates went up. We couldn't manage it. we started going to private partnerships and we couldn't manage it. Now, we still have similar challenges. And the only way we'll get out of that is, even if we are going to the private sector, we need to understand the private sector better and push for a race to the top. And the only way to do that is through coordination, to really get the best deals from the commercials and even from CAD funds. So go together, work together.
It is possible now that we've seen this cutback across the West, that one, African government should begin to invest more in the China competency, because it's appalling that 25 years of FOCAC and there are still very significant weaknesses in terms of understanding China or engaging China. Maybe some of the resources that were dedicated to the West will now be channeled in terms of pivoting to a partner that's reliable. Probably will see that. And we'll actually see also the Chinese opening up and being slightly more flexible, because in the way they source their deals and the kinds of deals that they end up taking. But we do not end our conversations, our podcast here at CGD, without asking our guests 2 questions. So the first one is, if we wave a wand and any policy, whatever policy it is, will be changed for the better. And then tell us an inspirational story, an impact story, or something from it. So we started with Hannah, so let's start with you now.
Great question. I don't know about the calculations for the most good, but in terms of the policies I would choose, one would be, I think we need to ring fence what remains of ODA and really preserve and ensure that ODA spending is directly targeted to the lowest income countries and serves its purpose as a development finance instrument. I would open up the rules around the OECD arrangement for export credit to all export credit agencies, China included. It would mitigate a lot of the negative competition and sort of trade wars that we're kind of currently descending into. And I think the second question was on a sort of interesting story that's happened on the job. ODI is sort of no 2 days are the same. But I think one of the moments that stood out to me in my current role in the last few years has been sort of having to step into convening moments when you weren't expecting to. We had an event that was being filmed live, and then there was a medical emergency at the last minute. And so on film, I had to pivot from being speaker to then moderating the event and leading the discussion. So that was a really great conversation that we had, and in the end, a sort of kickoff for our Brussels series of events. But yeah, it was an unexpected moment.
Hannah, what policy did you change with waving of a wand? And interesting story.
Yeah, I wish I had a lot of wands, a lot of opportunities to do that. But I think right now my wishful thinking would be for African governments not to agree to any mineral or trade deal that doesn't come with a huge injection of foreign direct investment into industrializing and processing those minerals or any other trade. That would be my ideal policy. I think it would do a lot of good because we need a lot of jobs and we've been commodity-focused countries for far too long, accepted a lot of deals that we didn't have to accept. I would want a policy of being stronger. And then a memorable moment, because we don't just do advisory work, we do trade and investment work. My moment was going to a supermarket before a meeting with Kenyan government officials from the Agriculture Ministry. This was in China. Sorry, I should have prefaced it with that. Going to a supermarket to buy some milk tea products and then taking them to what at the time was the most popular shop for tea, when kind of bubble tea was really, really taking off and cheese-topped tea was really taking off in China. It was called Hey Tea. And being in a massive queue with them and telling them about this new market and why they should do a great deal more to sell black tea to China, not just green. And like China's not just about green tea or white tea or other specialty tea. Milk tea is also super popular.
The queue for Hey Tea in London is also very long.
See, it goes across.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the CGD Podcast.
You can learn more about the topics discussed
on our website
at cgdev.org.
That's cgdev.org.
See you next time.